The burned-out tank destroyer sat at the crossroads like a steel gravestone, its turret twisted at an unnatural angle from the Panzerfaust that had knocked it out 3 days before. Staff Sergeant Audie Murphy crouched in the snow-filled ditch beside the road, studying the wreckage through his binoculars as dawn crept across the Vosges mountains. The January cold had frozen everything, the mud, the dead, and what was left of Charlie Company's hopes of holding this stretch of eastern France much longer. 27 men. That's what remained of a company that had started the winter push with over 100. The rest were scattered across aid stations, graves, registration points, and those dark pine forests where the fighting had been heaviest since New Year's Day. Now Murphy found himself the ranking NCO of a collection of riflemen, a machine gun team, and a radio operator who hadn't been able to raise battalion for 6 hours. The tank destroyer's main gun still pointed down the road toward German positions, its barrel elevated at the angle the crew had died trying to achieve. Sergeant Williams, the vehicle commander, had been Murphy's friend since Sicily. They'd shared cigarettes and talked about Texas during the long Mediterranean nights, back when the war seemed like something they might actually survive. Williams was buried now under a poncho behind the farmhouse that served as their temporary command post, waiting for Graves' registration to work their way up the frozen road. "Think she'll fire?" asked Private First Class Lattimore, nodding toward the destroyer's cannon. He was 19, from Michigan, and had been in the unit exactly 3 weeks, long enough to learn how to keep his rifle clean and dig a proper foxhole, but not long enough to stop asking questions that had no good answers. Murphy lowered his binoculars and studied the vehicle again. The hull looked intact, despite the hit that had killed the crew. More importantly, ammunition was still stacked in the fighting compartment. He could see the brass cases glinting in the early light. The Germans would come again today. They always did, when the weather cleared enough for their armor to move. And when they came, they'd come down this road, because it was the only route wide enough for their panzers in this part of the Vosges mountains. "Maybe," Murphy said quietly. "Question is whether anybody knows how to work it." The radio crackled with static, and Corporal Henderson, their communications man, looked up from where he'd been adjusting the antenna. "Still nothing, Sergeant. Either they're jammed or something happened to battalion." His voice carried that particular flatness that came when a soldier had been expecting help that wasn't coming. Murphy nodded, his mind working through possibilities that all seemed to end badly. The company had been ordered to hold this crossroads until relieved, but relief was supposed to have arrived yesterday. Now the snow was starting again, fat flakes that would cover their positions and give the Germans perfect concealment for an assault. They had ammunition for maybe 2 hours of serious fighting, no anti-tank weapons except for a couple of bazookas with questionable rockets, and no way to call for artillery support. But they also had that tank destroyer sitting there like a gift from Williams and his crew. The sound reached them before they saw anything, the grinding of tank tracks on frozen ground coming from the direction of the German lines. Murphy felt his stomach tighten as he recognized the particular rhythm of panzer transmissions. Heavy ones, from the sound. Panthers, maybe, or tigers if they were really unlucky. "Everybody down," he called softly, and his men melted into their positions around the crossroads. The machine gun team settled behind a stone wall that had once marked someone's property line. The riflemen spread out in the ditches and shell holes, their breath making small clouds in the cold air. Henderson crouched over his radio, still trying to raise somebody, anybody, who might send help. Through his binoculars, Murphy watched the tree line where the road emerged from the forest. Movement there, definitely. The methodical advance of infantry, supporting armor, the way the Germans always did it when they had time to do things properly. They'd probe first with a few men, then bring up the panzers when they thought they understood what they were facing. The first German soldiers appeared at the forest edge, 3 men in winter camouflage, moving carefully from tree to tree as they approached the crossroads. Murphy held his fire, knowing that his men were watching him, waiting for the signal that would start the fight. Too early, and they'd waste ammunition on a reconnaissance patrol. Too late, and they'd face the full assault without having thinned it out first. The tank destroyer loomed in his peripheral vision, its gun barrel still pointing down the road like an accusing finger. Somewhere in its fighting compartment were shells that could stop a panzer, if someone could figure out how to fire them. Murphy had watched Williams and his crew work the gun enough times to have a general idea of the process. But general ideas got people killed in combat. Still, it might be their only chance when the real attack came. One of the German scouts had reached the edge of the crossroads, close enough that Murphy could see the frost on his rifle barrel. The man was studying the tank destroyer, probably wondering if anyone was still alive inside it. Behind him, more figures moved through the trees, too many for a simple patrol. Murphy made his decision and squeezed the trigger. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation. And stay with us for the next chapters. The firefight lasted exactly 8 minutes by Henderson's watch, ending when the surviving German scouts melted back into the tree line, dragging their wounded with them. Murphy's men had fired disciplined, aimed shots, the way they'd been trained, but he could see in their faces that they understood what had just happened. They'd announced their presence to whatever was coming through those woods, and they'd used up ammunition they couldn't replace. "How many you count?" Murphy asked Sergeant Torres, who'd been watching the withdrawal through the machine gun's sight. "Maybe a dozen went back. 3 stayed." Torres was a steady man from New Mexico who'd been fighting since North Africa. If he said 3 stayed, then 3 Germans were dead in the snow near the crossroads. It was information, nothing more. In the Vosges Mountains, in January 1945, death had become a tactical consideration rather than a tragedy. Murphy moved along the line, checking his men and their ammunition situation. Not good, but not catastrophic yet. More importantly, none of them had been hit in the brief exchange, though Private Kemp's helmet showed a fresh gouge where a bullet had come closer than anyone wanted to think about. "Sergeant," Henderson called from the radio. "I'm getting something. Sounds like—" "Wait." He pressed his headset closer to his ear, frowning with concentration. "It's not battalion. Sounds like 1st Battalion, but they're supposed to be 5 miles south of here." Murphy crouched beside the radio operator. "Can you raise them?" "Trying, but the signal's weak. Mountains are playing hell with the radio waves." Henderson adjusted his controls, and through the static, fragments of transmission emerged. Something about a counterattack, references to map coordinates that didn't match anything around the crossroads, and underneath it all, the unmistakable tension of units under pressure. Through the static and broken words, Murphy began to piece together a picture that made his stomach drop. 1st Battalion was falling back. 3rd Battalion had lost contact with regiment. Something had gone wrong with the winter offensive, something big enough that entire units were being overrun or forced to withdraw. The crossroads that Charlie Company had been ordered to hold wasn't just tactically important. It might be the only route back to American lines for units that were retreating through the Vosges Mountains. "Keep trying," Murphy told Henderson. "See if you can get a clear picture of what's happening out there." But he already knew what was happening. They were alone, with no relief coming and no clear orders, except to hold a position that was about to become much more important than anyone had expected. The tank destroyer suddenly looked less like a gift and more like their only hope of survival. Murphy climbed up onto the vehicle's deck, ignoring the way the frozen metal burned through his gloves. The crew compartment was empty. Henderson and another man had carried Williams and his crew away the day the destroyer was hit, but the equipment was still there. Gun controls, ammunition racks, and the complex mechanisms that turned high explosive shells into dead panzers. The main gun was a 3-inch piece, capable of penetrating the frontal armor of anything short of a Tiger tank. More importantly, there were 17 rounds in the ready rack, each one marked with the specifications Williams had taught him to read during those long conversations in quieter moments. Armor-piercing, high-explosive, white phosphorus. Enough variety to handle whatever the Germans brought down that road if he could figure out how to fire them. "You thinking what I think you're thinking?" Torres had climbed up beside him, studying the gun controls with the expression of a man who'd seen enough desperate situations to recognize another one forming. "Somebody's got to work this thing when they come back," Murphy said. "And they will come back. That patrol was just checking to see what we had." "Williams tried to teach me the basics once," Torres admitted. "But there's a difference between watching someone else do it and actually pulling the trigger when panzers are shooting back at you." Murphy nodded, running his hands over the gun controls. The traverse mechanism, the elevation wheel, the firing trigger that looked deceptively simple for something that controlled so much destructive power. Williams had made it look easy, the way professionals always did, but Williams was dead and the panzers were still coming. The sound came again from the forest. Engines this time, not just the grinding of tracks. Multiple vehicles, moving with the confidence of a force that knew it outnumbered its opposition. Murphy didn't need binoculars to know what was coming. The morning reconnaissance had given the Germans everything they needed to plan a proper assault, and now they were bringing enough firepower to crush whatever they found at the crossroads. "Get the men ready," Murphy told Torres. "And tell Henderson to keep trying that radio. If there's anybody out there who can help us, now would be a good time to find them." But as he settled behind the tank destroyer's gun controls, Murphy knew that help wasn't coming. It was just Charlie Company's 27 men, a burned-out vehicle with 17 rounds of ammunition, and whatever courage they could find in themselves when the German armor broke through the tree line. In the Vosges Mountains, in the winter of 1945, it would have to be enough. The radio finally came alive at 09:47 hours, just as the first German tank emerged from the forest. Henderson's voice cut through the morning air with the kind of clarity that only came when communications were about to be permanently interrupted. All units, this is Foxtrot 2-6. We are pulling back to phase line Charlie. German breakthrough at map reference." The transmission dissolved into static, then returned with fragments. "Heavy casualties, unable to maintain. Good luck to any units still on the line." Murphy felt something cold settle in his stomach that had nothing to do with the January weather. Phase line Charlie was 15 miles behind them. If American units were falling back that far, then Charlie Company wasn't just cut off. They were sitting in the middle of what was about to become German-controlled territory. "How many panzers?" Torres asked, his voice steady despite the situation. Murphy counted through his binoculars. 3, no, 4. Panthers, looks like. He watched the massive tanks navigate between the trees, their crews taking their time because they could see that the crossroads ahead was held by nothing more than infantry. Behind the armor, German soldiers moved in organized groups, too many to count quickly. The lead panzer stopped at the forest edge, its turret traversing slowly as the crew examined the crossroads. Murphy could imagine the conversation inside that steel box, the commander studying the knocked-out American tank destroyer, calculating angles and distances, deciding how much caution was necessary against what appeared to be a company of half-frozen GIs. "Sergeant Murphy," Private Lattimore had crawled over from his position in the roadside ditch. "My dad worked on tractors back home. If that gun works anything like a big tractor, maybe I can help with the mechanical parts." Murphy looked at the kid, because that's what Lattimore was, despite 3 weeks of combat experience, and saw something that reminded him of himself a year ago. Scared but determined, young enough to still believe that courage and mechanical aptitude might be enough to solve problems that had no good solutions. "Get up here," Murphy said, "but keep your head down. When this starts, it's going to happen fast." Together, they examined the tank destroyer's gun controls, while Torres kept watch on the German formation. The elevation mechanism was straightforward, a wheel that raised and lowered the barrel. The traverse controls were more complex, but Latimore's farm background showed as he traced the mechanical linkages with his finger. "This thing here," Latimore said, pointing to a lever near the gunner's position, "that's got to be the firing mechanism. But see this gauge? I think the gun's got to be properly seated before it'll fire. Don't want the recoil tearing the whole mounting apart." Murphy nodded, filing the information away. Williams had mentioned something similar during one of their conversations, back when learning about tank destroyers had seemed like interesting professional development rather than desperate necessity. The irony wasn't lost on him that a dead friend's casual instruction might be the key to keeping the rest of them alive. The German commander had apparently finished his reconnaissance. The lead panzer lurched forward, followed by its companions, and the crossroads battle began with the methodical advance of 40-ton killing machines supported by veteran infantry. Murphy watched them come and felt the familiar sensation of time slowing down, the way it always did when the shooting was about to start. "Henderson," he called to the radio operator. "One more try. If anybody's monitoring this frequency, tell them Charlie Company is about to make a stand at—" He looked at his map, finding the crossroads designation. "Grid reference 347219. If we don't make it, tell them we held as long as we could." "Audie." The transmission went out into the static-filled air of the Vosges Mountains, probably unheard and certainly unanswered. But it established the record, the official acknowledgement that Charlie Company had been here, had fought, and had chosen to stand when falling back might have been the wiser option. The 1st Panzer was 200 yards away now, close enough that Murphy could see the snow kicked up by its tracks, the way its main gun swiveled to track potential targets among the American positions. Behind it, German infantry spread out in textbook assault formation, using the armor as mobile cover while they advanced on what they assumed would be a routine mopping-up operation. "You know what nobody talks about?" Lattimore said quietly, his hands steady on the gun controls, despite the approaching danger. "How loud everything gets, the engines, the tracks, even the snow crunching under their boots, like the whole world's turned into a machine." Murphy understood what the kid meant. Combat in the Vosges Mountains had a particular sound, steel against stone, engines laboring in the cold, the sharp crack of rifle fire echoing off the hillsides. Different from the desert fighting in North Africa, different from the Italian mountains. Every battlefield had its own acoustic signature, and this one was about to become very loud indeed. "Whatever happens," Murphy told his men, "we make them pay for this crossroads. Every yard, every minute. Maybe that buys time for somebody else to get away." The lead panzer was 100 yards out now, its commander probably wondering why the Americans hadn't opened fire yet. Murphy had his hands on the tank destroyer's gun controls, Lattimore beside him working the mechanical systems, and Torres calling out ranges and bearing changes. 27 men against a German assault force that outnumbered them at least 3-1, with armor support that should have made the outcome inevitable. Should have. But Murphy had learned in North Africa, Sicily, and Italy that "should have" was a phrase that didn't always apply when scared young men decided to stand and fight instead of running away. Would you follow the orders exactly? Or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. The first shot came from the lead panzer at 75 yards, its main gun belching flame and smoke as the crew decided to eliminate what they assumed was an abandoned American position. The shell screamed over the tank destroyer and exploded against the stone wall behind Torres's machine gun position, showering everyone with fragments of rock and frozen earth. Murphy felt the destroyer's gun controls under his hands and made a decision that Williams would have either applauded or called completely insane. Instead of waiting for the perfect shot, he aimed for the lead panzer's tracks and pulled the firing trigger. The 3-inch gun roared, its recoil rocking the entire vehicle despite the stabilizing mechanisms. Through the smoke and concussion, Murphy saw his shot impact low and to the right, a miss but close enough to send the German crew into evasive maneuvers. More importantly, it announced to the entire battlefield that the American position was still very much alive and capable of fighting back. "Load armor piercing," he called to Lattimore, who was already wrestling with the next round. The kid's mechanical intuition was proving invaluable. Somehow, he'd figured out the loading sequence that had taken Williams's crew months to perfect. The German response was immediate and overwhelming. All 4 panzers opened fire simultaneously, their combined muzzle flashes turning the crossroads into a hellscape of exploding shells and flying debris. Murphy felt the destroyer shake as near misses bracketed their position, and somewhere behind him, someone was screaming for a medic. But the tank destroyer's gun was still functional, and Murphy had 14 rounds left. The second shot was better, a direct hit on the lead panzer's frontal slope that didn't penetrate but sent sparks flying, and apparently convinced the crew to back off and reassess the situation. The third shot missed entirely, sailing over the target as Murphy overcorrected for range. The fourth shot hit the second panzer in the track housing and brought it to a grinding halt, its crew immediately beginning to bail out as smoke poured from the engine compartment. "Sergeant!" Torres was shouting from somewhere in the chaos. "Infantry on the right flank! They're trying to get around behind us!" Murphy spared a glance from the gun sight and saw what Torres meant. While the panzer crews had been trading shots with the destroyer, German infantry had been working their way through the forest on both sides of the road. Standard tactics: fix the enemy with direct fire, then envelop from the flanks where the defenders couldn't bring their heavy weapons to bear. It was textbook German assault doctrine, and it should have worked perfectly. Would have worked, except that Murphy had no intention of staying in the destroyer's fighting compartment when the infantry got close enough to use grenades and panzerfausts. Instead, he did something that Williams would have called tactically unsound and personally suicidal. He climbed out of the tank destroyer. "Keep loading," he told Lattimore, grabbing his carbine and a canvas bag of grenades from the fighting compartment. "I'll be back." What followed was 3 minutes of combat that would later be described in after-action reports as an aggressive defense of the position and exemplary leadership under fire. What it felt like to Murphy was a blur of running, shooting, and trying to stay alive long enough to get back to the destroyer's gun. The German infantry had gotten closer than he'd expected, close enough that he could see individual faces under their helmets, close enough that grenades were exploding within yards of Charlie Company's positions. Murphy moved between his men's foxholes, firing his carbine at targets that appeared and disappeared among the trees, calling out warnings about German movements that might otherwise have gone unnoticed. A Panzerfaust team had set up behind a fallen log, trying to get an angle on the tank destroyer. Murphy put a burst of carbine fire into their position, saw one man fall and another dive for cover, then kept moving, because staying still meant dying in this kind of fighting. The machine gun position was in trouble. Torres had taken shrapnel in his left arm and was trying to operate the weapon one-handed, while his assistant gunner fed ammunition. Murphy slid into their hole, helped Torres get the gun back into action, and together they raked the German infantry positions until the belt ran dry. "Can you keep this up?" Murphy asked, noting the blood on Torres's sleeve. "Long enough," Torres replied, already reaching for another belt of ammunition. "You get back to that gun. We need those panzers dealt with before they decide to rush us." Murphy sprinted back to the destroyer, diving into the fighting compartment, just as another German shell exploded nearby. Lattimore had somehow managed to keep the gun loaded and ready despite the chaos around him, and Murphy could see 2 more panzers maneuvering for better firing positions. The next shot was the best he'd fired all day, a perfect hit on the side armor of the 3rd Panzer that penetrated cleanly and sent smoke boiling from every hatch. The crew bailed out immediately, abandoning their vehicle as secondary explosions began to cook off the ammunition inside. But the German infantry assault was reaching its climax, and Murphy could see his men's positions being overrun one by one. Henderson was still trying to work his radio, despite a shell fragment that had opened a gash across his forehead. Private Kemp was down, clutching his leg and calling for help that wasn't coming. The crossroads position was about to collapse, and with it, any hope of keeping the route open for other American units trying to fall back through the Vosges Mountains. That's when Murphy made the decision that would follow him for the rest of his life. He climbed onto the tank destroyer's deck, in full view of every German soldier in the area, and began firing the main gun at point-blank range into the enemy infantry positions. What the citation would later call conspicuous gallantry in action against an armed enemy felt like controlled terror wrapped in mechanical precision. Standing exposed on the tank destroyer's deck, Murphy worked the gun controls while German bullets snapped through the air around him and mortar shells walked closer with each explosion. The secret that no after-action report would ever capture was how much of his success came down to luck and the fact that the Germans couldn't believe what they were seeing. A single American soldier standing in the open, using a tank destroyer's main gun like an oversized rifle against infantry positions. It was so contrary to normal tactical doctrine that it took the German commanders precious minutes to coordinate an effective response. Those minutes saved Charlie Company. Murphy traversed the gun left and fired a high-explosive round into a cluster of Germans who'd been advancing through the roadside ditch. The blast scattered the assault group and gave Torres's machine gun team time to relocate to a better position. He traversed right and put another round into a mortar position that had been dropping shells uncomfortably close to Henderson's radio setup. "Audie!" Lattimore was shouting from inside the destroyer. "They're flanking us again, right side, through those trees." Murphy could see them, a squad of German infantry moving with the fluid efficiency of veterans who'd done this same maneuver dozens of times before. In normal circumstances, they would have overwhelmed the American position within minutes. But these weren't normal circumstances, and Murphy was operating far beyond anything resembling normal tactical doctrine. He swiveled the gun to track the flanking movement and fired another high-explosive round, this one set for proximity detonation that scattered steel fragments through the trees where the Germans were advancing. The assault wavered, stopped, then began to fall back as the survivors realized they were taking casualties from an enemy who should have been suppressed by now. The German panzer crews were apparently having the same problem with belief. Murphy could see the remaining two tanks maneuvering for clear shots at the destroyer, but their commanders seemed reluctant to fire while their own infantry was so close to the target. It was a command dilemma that bought Murphy more time, but he knew it wouldn't last. Eventually, someone would decide that eliminating the American gun was worth the risk to their own men. "How many rounds left?" he called down to Lattimore. 8, maybe 9. The kid's voice was steady despite the chaos, his farm background serving him well in the mechanical aspects of keeping the gun fed and operational. 8 rounds. Murphy calculated quickly, trying to estimate how many targets were still active and which ones posed the greatest threat to his men. The math wasn't encouraging. Charlie Company's perimeter was shrinking, their ammunition was running low, and the German assault showed no signs of slackening despite the casualties they'd taken. But something else was happening that Murphy hadn't expected. His men, who should have been looking for opportunities to withdraw or surrender, were instead fighting with an intensity that matched his own. Torres had somehow gotten his machine gun back into action despite his wounded arm. Henderson was not only working his radio, but calling out target information for the tank destroyer's gun. Even wounded men like Private Kemp were still firing their rifles from whatever cover they could find. It was as if Murphy's decision to stand and fight on the destroyer's deck had infected his entire unit with the same stubborn refusal to acknowledge that they were beaten. The psychology of combat was strange that way. Sometimes one man's courage became contagious, spreading through a unit until everyone was performing far beyond what they'd thought possible. Murphy put his 7th round into the lead Panzer's frontal armor and finally achieved the penetration he'd been seeking. The German tank shuddered to a halt, smoke pouring from its hatches as the crew abandoned the vehicle. One down, one more still active, and maybe 50 German infantry still pressing the assault from multiple directions. The last Panzer commander had apparently decided that enough was enough. Murphy saw the turret swivel in his direction and knew he had perhaps 3 seconds before a high-velocity shell turned the tank destroyer into scrap metal. In those 3 seconds, he could have jumped down into the fighting compartment, could have sought cover behind the gun shield, could have made any number of choices that might have kept him alive. Instead, he traversed the destroyer's gun to track the German tank and fired his 8th round at the same moment the Panzer's main gun fired at him. The 2 shells passed each other in the cold January air above the crossroads, and Murphy had time to notice how strange it was that he could actually see the German projectile, a dark streak against the snow-heavy clouds that seemed to hang suspended for an impossible moment before physics reasserted itself and both rounds reached their target simultaneously. Murphy's shot struck the German Panzer in the turret ring and jammed the traverse mechanism, effectively disabling the tank's main armament. The German shot hit the tank destroyer's gun shield and ricocheted upward, close enough that Murphy felt the heat of its passage and the sting of metal fragments against his face. But he was still alive, still standing, and the German assault was finally beginning to break. From his exposed position on the destroyer's deck, Murphy could see what the Germans probably couldn't. Their attack had lost its coordination. Individual squads were still fighting, but the unified pressure that had nearly overwhelmed Charlie Company's positions was fragmenting. Some units were falling back toward the forest. Others were seeking cover while they waited for orders that weren't coming. Murphy fired his 9th and final armor-piercing round at the disabled Panzer, this shot penetrating cleanly and setting off the internal ammunition storage. The explosion lit up the entire crossroads, and in its orange glare, Murphy could see German infantry beginning a general withdrawal. They'd held. Somehow, against odds that should have made victory impossible, Charlie Company had held the crossroads. The silence that followed the German withdrawal was deafening in its completeness. No more tank engines, no rifle fire, no shouted orders in German or English. Just the whisper of snow falling on metal and the distant sound of retreating vehicles disappearing into the Vosges Mountains forest. Murphy climbed down from the tank destroyer's deck on legs that felt disconnected from his body, the adrenaline that had sustained him through the past hour beginning to fade into something that resembled normal human exhaustion. Lattimore emerged from the fighting compartment with oil stains on his uniform and an expression that suggested he was still processing what they'd just survived. "You okay, kid?" Murphy asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear an honest answer. "I think so. Maybe. Ask me again tomorrow." Lattimore looked back at the destroyer's gun, its barrel still elevated at the angle they'd used for the final shot. "My dad's not going to believe this when I write home. Hell, I'm not sure I believe it." Murphy understood the feeling. Combat had a way of seeming unreal, even while it was happening, as if the human mind couldn't quite accept the intensity of what the body was being asked to endure. Later, in quiet moments, the memories would return with perfect clarity. The sound of shells passing overhead, the smell of cordite and burning metal, the way his hands had moved on the gun controls without conscious thought. Torres appeared from his machine gun position, his left arm in an improvised sling, but his expression suggesting he'd remain functional for whatever came next. "Casualties are lighter than they should be," he reported. "Kemp's got a busted leg. Henderson took some shrapnel, couple other guys got dinged up, but everybody's breathing." It was better news than Murphy had dared hope for. In the chaos of the assault, he'd expected to lose half his men or more. The fact that Charlie Company was still mostly intact was either a minor miracle or evidence that luck played a larger role in combat survival than anyone wanted to admit. The radio crackled, and Henderson's voice came from the communications position. "Sergeant Murphy, I've got contact with battalion. They want a full report." Murphy walked over to take the handset, already composing in his mind the kind of report that would satisfy the staff officers without conveying the full reality of what had happened at the crossroads. "How did you explain that a tank destroyer with a dead crew had been brought back to life by a farm kid who'd never seen the inside of an armored vehicle before today? How did you describe standing on an open deck, firing a main gun at infantry positions while panzers shot back?" "Charlie 6 Actual, this is Murphy," he said into the handset. "Charlie Company has successfully defended the crossroads at grid reference 347219. Enemy casualties estimated at 2 panzers destroyed, 1 damaged, and approximately 30 infantry. We are low on ammunition, but prepared to continue holding the position." The voice that came back through the static was Colonel Harrison, the battalion commander who'd been Murphy's officer since Sicily. "Outstanding work, Sergeant. Relief is en route, should reach you within 2 hours. Can you hold until then?" "Affirmative, sir. We'll be here." But as Murphy handed the radio back to Henderson, he knew that the official version of events was already diverging from what had actually happened. The after-action report would describe tactical dispositions, enemy strength estimates, and ammunition expenditures. It would mention that Sergeant Murphy had operated a tank destroyer gun with effectiveness against enemy armor. It would note that casualties were light and the position was successfully defended. What it wouldn't capture was the way Lattimore's hands had shaken as he loaded those last few rounds, or the look in Torres's eyes when he realized they might actually survive. It wouldn't describe the moment when Murphy had climbed onto that deck and committed himself to a course of action that should have resulted in his death. Most importantly, it wouldn't convey the weight that would settle on his shoulders in the weeks and months that followed, as the story grew in the telling and became something larger than the reality he remembered. 3 months later, Murphy found himself in a Pentagon office, standing at attention while a general read from a citation that transformed the Crossroads fight into language suitable for official recognition. The words were accurate but somehow hollow, describing actions and results without capturing the fear, confusion, and desperate improvisation that had actually characterized the event. "The President of the United States takes pride in presenting the Distinguished Service Cross to Staff Sergeant Audie L. Murphy." The general's voice continued, but Murphy found himself thinking about Williams, buried somewhere in the Vosges Mountains, and wondering what his friend would have thought about a farm boy from Texas learning to operate a tank destroyer by trial and error under combat conditions. After the ceremony, Murphy walked out of the Pentagon and into the Virginia sunshine, carrying a medal that represented courage and sacrifice, but somehow felt inadequate to the task of containing the memory of that January morning. The citation would follow him for the rest of his life, becoming part of his official record and eventually part of American military history. But the real weight, the memory of standing exposed on that tank destroyer deck, the sound of Lattimore's voice calling out mechanical instructions, the sight of his men choosing to fight when retreat might have been wiser, that would remain his private burden. Some weights couldn't be shared, couldn't be adequately described in citations or after-action reports. 40 years later, Murphy would sometimes wake in the middle of the night with the smell of cordite in his nostrils and the sound of tank engines in his ears. The medal was in a drawer somewhere, but the crossroads was still there in his memory, as vivid and immediate as if it had happened yesterday. Williams was still dead. Lattimore was probably a grandfather by now, and the Vosges Mountains had returned to peaceful forests where tourists hiked, without knowing that young Americans had once fought and died among those trees. But for Murphy, it would always be January 1945, and he would always be standing on that tank destroyer deck, making choices that seemed impossible then and felt heavier with each passing year. If this story reminded you that behind every medal there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.